My name is Gerald Mack. I am 61 years old. And 6 weeks ago, a hospital administrator in a pressed gray suit looked me up and down in a corridor and told me, with the specific confidence of a man who has never been wrong about anything in his professional life, that the woman I was asking about was a surgeon, not my daughter. I told him I had also funded the wing we were standing in. He checked the plaque on the wall behind him. Then he looked at me again. This is that story. But before I get to the hospital corridor and the plaque and the look on that man's face, I need to tell you who I am and who my daughter is and how we got to that moment, because none of it makes sense without the years that came before it. My name is Gerald Mack. I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, the second of 4 children in a house that was small enough that privacy was a concept rather than a reality, and loud enough that you learned early to make yourself heard or accept being unheard. And I chose the former. My father worked in a petrochemical plant for 33 years. My mother cleaned houses for families whose addresses I eventually learned to recognize as the prosperous parts of town. We were not poor in the way that leaves permanent damage, but we were close enough to that line that the line was always visible, always relevant, always the thing that organized the distance between what we had and what other people had. I was a good student, not effortlessly good. The kind of good that comes from understanding early that the distance between where you start and where you want to go is measured in hours of work, and that the hours are entirely under your control, and nothing else about your situation is. My father used to say, Gerald, the world is not interested in what you intend. It is interested in what you produce. He said it in the specific way of a man who had learned it not from a book, but from 33 years of showing up to a plant in the dark and doing the work regardless of whether the work was acknowledged, and discovering over time that acknowledgement was not the point. The point was the work. I understood this at a level I could not fully articulate when I was 17, and standing in front of a grocery store at 6 in the morning before school started. I understand it now in a way that has reorganized most of what I thought I knew about how the world works. I finished high school at the top of my class in 1981 and went to Louisiana State on a partial academic scholarship that I supplemented with 2 part-time jobs, one at a grocery store and one delivering packages on weekends in a truck that overheated if you pushed it past 55 miles an hour. I carried both those jobs for 3 years. The scholarship covered tuition. The jobs covered everything else, which was a lot of everything. I studied business, not because business was my passion in the way that people talk about passion now, as though every professional life is supposed to be organized around a feeling. I studied business because I understood systems. I understood how things moved from one place to another and what the friction points were and where the value was created and where it was lost. I was, from the beginning, a person who looked at how things worked and could see fairly quickly where they were working less well than they should. There is a kind of intelligence that does not announce itself. It does not produce the student who dominates classroom discussions or the professional who fills the room with presence from the first minute. It produces someone who is very quiet and very accurate, someone who watches a process for long enough to understand it completely before saying anything about it. I was that kind of student, and I became that kind of professional. My professors knew who I was because my papers were correct and incisive and turned in before the deadline. My classmates knew who I was because I was the person they came to before exams when they needed someone to explain the material in a way that was useful rather than impressive. I graduated in 1985 with honors that I had not advertised and a clearer picture of what I was going to do next than most of the people in my graduating class, who were still working out their general direction. I knew mine. I was going to learn how institutions worked from the inside, spend several years accumulating that knowledge at someone else's expense, and then build something of my own. After graduation, I spent 4 years at a regional bank in Baton Rouge doing commercial lending, learning the architecture of how money moved through industries. I was thorough to a degree that some of my colleagues found excessive and my superiors found reliable, which was the useful distinction. I read every credit agreement I was given responsibility for until I understood not only what it said, but why it said it that way, what risk the language was designed to manage, and whether it succeeded. By my 3rd year, I was writing analysis that the senior credit officers were routing to clients as guidance, which was gratifying and also somewhat clarifying about the institution's relationship to its own intellectual capacity. Then I moved to Houston and spent 3 years at a larger firm doing the same work at larger scale, which revealed something important. The principles did not change at scale. The numbers were larger, and the counterparties were larger, and the stakes were larger, but the fundamental question was always the same. Where is the value? Where is the risk? And does the price reflect the accurate relationship between the two? I answered that question well enough that I was promoted twice in 3 years and offered a managing director track that would have set me up very comfortably for the following 20 years inside an institution that would have been glad to have me and that I would have been reasonably content inside. I turned it down and started my first company. It was a logistics consultancy, small, 2 employees, which included me. We helped mid-sized manufacturing companies understand why their supply chains were costing more than they should and what to do about it. I was 31 years old. I had saved enough money to run the company for 18 months without a client, and I had 2 clients within 6 weeks, which meant the 18 months was never required, but knowing it was there made every conversation easier. That company grew, slowly at first, then faster once the reputation built. By the time I was 40, I had 40 employees in offices in Houston and Atlanta. By 45, I had sold that company to a larger consulting group for enough money that the number, when I heard it spoken aloud for the first time by the acquiring firm's CFO, required me to be very still for a moment. I started a second company, infrastructure investment this time, a private fund focused on healthcare and municipal infrastructure in underserved markets. Not from charity, from the understanding that the most durable returns in real estate and infrastructure came from places that larger capital had ignored because the story was too complicated for a standard model. My partners thought I was wrong. The returns demonstrated otherwise. I tell you all of this not to catalog achievements. I tell you because the money is relevant to the story, and I want the money to be understood in its full context before it appears in a hospital corridor. My daughter's name is Diana. She is 34 years old, and she is a cardiothoracic surgeon at a hospital in Atlanta that I will not name specifically because she has not authorized me to name it, and her privacy belongs to her. She has been a surgeon for 6 years. She specialized in cardiothoracic surgery because when she was 11 years old, her grandmother, my mother, had a cardiac event that required emergency surgery, and Diana sat in a waiting room for 7 hours, while strangers operated on the woman who had taught her to make biscuits and read her bedtime stories in a voice that went quiet and theatrical at all the right moments. The surgery was successful. Diana decided in that waiting room what she was going to do with her life. She is extraordinary at it. I say that not as a father, though I say it as a father too. I say it as someone who has watched her operate in the way I watch any serious professional operate, which is by looking at the quality of the decisions and the efficiency of the execution and the outcomes over time. Diana's outcomes are exceptional. Her complication rates are among the lowest in her department. Her colleagues, including senior surgeons who have been in the field for 30 years, treat her with the specific deference that competence generates in rooms full of competent people. I have watched her in professional contexts on a handful of occasions. Not in surgery. I have not been in a surgical suite and do not expect to be. But at a departmental conference, she invited me to 3 years ago, where she presented outcome data from a series of complex cases. I watched her in front of a room of her peers, and I understood something about who she had become that you cannot fully understand from phone calls and holiday visits. She is a different person in that room than she is at my dinner table, not a better version or a more real version, a version of herself that was built entirely outside my presence, and that belongs entirely to the work. There is something about watching your child be excellent in a room where you have no jurisdiction that is, in my experience, the most purely satisfying thing a parent can feel. She got there on her own. I want to say that with absolute clarity because it matters. I paid for her education the way I paid for everything in Diana's life when she was growing up, which is to say, I paid for it as a parent whose job was to make sure the resources were present so that the talent could do what the talent needed to do. I did not get her into medical school. I did not make any calls. I did not sit at her interviews. She got into Emory Medical School because she was, at 22, one of the most prepared and focused young people that committee had seen in a long time, and she graduated near the top of her class on her own terms, and she matched into her surgical residency at a program that accepted 4 candidates from 400 applicants, and she earned every room she has ever stood in. I paid for none of her surgical training. I want to repeat that because it is important. She earned her position. The money I have given to the hospital where she works came years after she was already there, already established, already regarded. The sequence matters. The gift did not create the career. The career was already there. The gift was something else. Let me tell you about the gift. 3 years ago, the hospital's cardiothoracic department head, a man named Dr. Reginald Osei, called me. Not because I was Diana's father, because I had been introduced to him at a conference in Charlotte by a mutual contact who knew that Dr. Osei was trying to raise capital for an expansion of the department's surgical wing, and that I was someone whose fund had done significant work in healthcare infrastructure. We had a conversation at that conference about the specific constraints on cardiac surgery outcomes that came from inadequate surgical suite technology and recovery infrastructure. It was a technical conversation and a genuine one, and at the end of it, Dr. Osei said, "Mr. Mack, if you are ever interested in discussing what we are trying to build, I would like to continue this conversation. I called him 2 weeks later. The conversation continued for 6 months. Site visits, budget reviews, outcome data, impact modeling. I did the same analysis I would do on any infrastructure investment, which is to say I was thorough and I was skeptical, and I asked the questions that most charitable donors do not ask, because most charitable donors are making gifts rather than investments. And I was, and remain, someone who does both, but treats them with the same rigor. I want to tell you what those 6 months of due diligence actually looked like, because the version of this story that is easiest to tell is the version where a wealthy man writes a large check because his daughter works at a hospital. And that is not what happened. What happened was considerably more methodical. I read 5 years of the department's published outcome data. I hired a healthcare consultant with no connection to the hospital to review it independently and tell me if what I was reading was accurate and contextualized correctly. It was. I visited the surgical suites twice, once announced and once on short notice, and I spent 4 hours on each visit understanding the physical constraints that limited surgical capacity. I met with 3 members of the nursing staff separately from the surgeons and the administrators because nursing staff understand the operational reality of a clinical environment in ways that leadership often does not, and their assessment of where the constraints actually lived was specific and credible and aligned with what the data showed. I asked Dr. Osei hard questions, not to be difficult, to understand whether he was someone whose assessment I should trust with a significant sum. He answered every question I asked with the directness of a man who had been thinking about these problems for long enough that the questions were not novel to him, only the presence of someone asking them carefully. By the 4th month, I had decided I would make the gift. The remaining 2 months were about the structure of it, the legal framework, the naming rights agreement, the conditions and reporting requirements, and the communication plan. I told Diana before the announcement. That conversation mattered more to me than the gift itself. At the end of 6 months, I committed a significant gift to the expansion of the cardiothoracic surgical wing. I will not say the exact number because it is not relevant to the story, and because the number has a way of becoming the headline in a way that misrepresents what I want to say. It was substantial. It was enough to fund the majority of the physical expansion and a portion of the equipment upgrades. The naming rights to the wing were part of the agreement, which is standard practice in major hospital philanthropy. I told Diana. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, I need to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Did you do this because of me?" I said, "The conversation with Dr. Osei started before either of us knew you were at this hospital. The investment is in the work of the department, not in your presence in it." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I believe you, and I want you to know that it's also going to make things complicated for me professionally. People are going to think my position here is connected to your gift." I said, "People are going to think whatever they think. Your record speaks for itself." She said, "I know that. But there's a difference between knowing something and having to prove it every day in a room full of people who doubt it." That is the most honest thing she has ever said to me about what it costs to be exceptional in a room where some people are looking for reasons to discount the exception. I told her I understood. I have thought about that conversation many times in the 3 years since. I have thought about whether I made the right decision, not about the gift itself, but about the timing and the communication, and whether I handled it in a way that was fully respectful of the professional life she had built independently of me. I have not arrived at a clean answer. I think I made a decision that was right in the ways that mattered most, and complicated in the ways that are hardest to anticipate. That is the most accurate accounting I can give. The wing opened 14 months after the commitment, a ceremony, a ribbon, a plaque with a name on it that I had spent 30 years building. I attended, but not prominently. I sat in the back of the room and watched the department head speak, and watched the hospital president speak, and watched the assembled staff and board members, and I thought about my mother in a waiting room in Shreveport, and my 11-year-old daughter deciding the direction of her entire life, while strangers kept a woman alive inside an operating room. Diana spoke briefly at the ceremony. She thanked the department and the surgical teams, and she was precise and warm and said nothing about me specifically, which was, as it turned out, the correct call. Now let me tell you about 6 weeks ago. I had come to the hospital for a reason that had nothing to do with the wing or the gift or any professional matter. I had come because Diana had called me the previous evening to tell me that she was going to be on call over the weekend, and that she had a patient, a man in his late 50s who had been transferred from a regional hospital in rural Georgia with a cardiac situation that was going to require surgery, and that the surgery was going to be difficult, and she was going to do it, and she was fine, but she wanted me to know. She did not ask me to come. That is important. I want to be clear about that. She called to tell me not to summon me. Diana is 34 years old, and she does not need her father present for professional challenges. She has been doing professional challenges without her father present for her entire career. She called because we are close. Because we have always been close in the specific way of two people who are both direct and competent and respect those qualities in each other, and telling me was the thing she wanted to do the night before a difficult surgery. I came because I wanted to be close to the building. Not inside the operating room, not in her way, just close to the building the way a parent is sometimes close to a building where their child is doing something difficult and enormous, not to intervene, but to be in the same gravitational field as whatever was happening. I drove to Atlanta on a Saturday morning. I parked in the visitor lot. I went inside because it was the middle of August in Georgia, and I am 61 years old, and standing in an August parking lot for 4 hours was not something my body was interested in negotiating. I went to the main reception desk and asked if there was somewhere I could wait. The woman at the desk was pleasant and efficient and pointed me toward a waiting area near the elevator bank on the main floor. I thanked her and walked in that direction. The waiting area was down a corridor that ran adjacent to the cardiothoracic wing. I had not planned this. It was simply the direction I was pointed. As I walked down this corridor, a man came out of a side office and walked in the same direction, and we were briefly walking together in the way of two people heading toward the same general destination. He was perhaps 45, pressed gray suit, the kind of institutional authority in his bearing that hospitals produce in their administrative staff, a specific combination of professional confidence and spatial ownership. The physical expression of a man who knows every square foot of a building and has opinions about all of them. He had the walk of someone who is always slightly in a hurry and wants you to know it, the walk that signals importance through velocity. He glanced at me. I am a 61-year-old black man in a hospital on a Saturday morning, wearing what I wore to drive to Atlanta, which was a good jacket over a good shirt and no tie, because I did not anticipate needing a tie to sit in a waiting room. I mention this not for the obvious reason, though the obvious reason is also present. I mention it because the glance registered something, and what it registered was an assessment, and the assessment took a fraction of a second and arrived at a conclusion, and the conclusion was visible in the way the man's posture adjusted. I have been having this specific experience for 61 years. The fraction of a second assessment, the posture adjustment that follows. I have had it in bank lobbies and hotel lobbies and airport lounges and conference rooms and at the entrances to events where my name was on the guest list, and the person checking the list did not look at the list before they looked at me. I no longer feel it the way I felt it when I was 25 and still carried the hope that each new room would be different. I feel it now the way you feel a familiar weather pattern, accurately and without drama and with the knowledge of exactly how long it lasts and what it costs and what it does not cost. He said, "Can I help you find something?" His tone was the professional tone, helpful on the surface, directional in its architecture, the kind of tone that contains without stating the assumption that the person being addressed needs direction. I told him I was there to wait for a family member who was in surgery. He said, of course, the family waiting area is on the 3rd floor. I told him I had already found an area on this floor near the elevator bank, and the woman at reception had directed me there. He said, "The cardiothoracic family waiting area is on the 3rd floor. This corridor is for clinical staff and administrative personnel. I can direct you upstairs." I said, "I appreciate it. I'll find my way." He said, "I'd be happy to walk you up." There was a texture to this offer that I have encountered enough times in my life to recognize on contact. It was not an offer. It was a directive delivered in the form of an offer, which is a specific kind of management that people in institutional roles learn to deploy when they want to redirect someone without the confrontation of a direct instruction. I stopped walking. I said, "I'm actually going to stay on this floor." He said, "Sir, I'm afraid this corridor is restricted to." I said, "I'm waiting for my daughter. She's in surgery." He said, "I understand. And the family waiting area for our surgical patients is—" I said, "She's not a patient." He paused. I said, "She's a surgeon. She's performing the surgery." He looked at me. And then he did the thing that I have spent 6 weeks deciding how I feel about, which is that he recalibrated. Not rudely, efficiently. The way a man recalibrates when new information arrives that requires a small adjustment to his operating model. He said, "Oh, I apologize. What's the surgeon's name? I can check whether—" I said, "Her name is Dr. Diana Mack." He processed this. I watched him process it. The name was registering. I could see it registering. Diana had been in this department for 6 years, and she was not invisible. But the processing was coming from one direction, and some other piece of information was coming from another direction, and they were about to meet. He said, "And you are—" I said, "Gerald Mack, her father." More processing. He said, "I see, and you're here to—" I said, "Wait, for my daughter." who is performing surgery, as I mentioned. He said, of course, yes, I apologize. He paused, doing the specific thing people do when they are adjusting a position they have already committed to and need to find a way to do it without fully acknowledging what they are adjusting from. I just want to make sure you're comfortable. Can I get you anything? There's a private waiting area that I can arrange access to. It's typically reserved for board members and major donors and... I said, I appreciate that. I'm fine where I am. He said, of course. He seemed about to leave. Then he said, and I want to apologize again if I seemed... I said, you seemed like a man doing his job. I understand. He nodded. He seemed uncertain whether this was forgiveness or not, which is the correct uncertainty to have because I am also not entirely sure. He turned to go back toward his office, and then, as he turned, his eye caught the plaque on the wall at the end of the corridor, the one that had been there for 14 months, the one with the name on it, dark lettering on brushed steel, the Mack Family Cardiothoracic Surgical Wing, set into the wall at the point where the corridor opened into the expanded section of the department. He stopped. He looked at the plaque. He looked at me. He looked at the plaque again. I did not say anything. I want to be precise about this because I could have said something and I chose not to. And the choice was not because I lacked the words. I had the words, several versions of them. I chose not to use them because I did not need to. The wall had already said what needed to be said. It had been saying it for 14 months. I simply had not been in the corridor when someone needed to read it. The man said, Mr. Mack. His voice had changed in a way that I found, in the moment, more interesting than satisfying. I said, enjoy your Saturday. Then I walked to the elevator bank and took the elevator to the 3rd floor and sat in the family waiting area and drank a cup of coffee from the machine in the corner, which was not good coffee, but was hot. And I read for 2 hours on my phone, and at some point I fell asleep in the chair the way you fall asleep in a hospital waiting room, which is with your body present and your mind only partially absent, one part of you always listening for footsteps. Diana came out of surgery at 4 in the afternoon. She found me in the waiting area because I had texted her when I arrived, which is the correct version of being present in a building where your child is working, visible but not intrusive. She was still in scrubs. Her hair was back, and she had the specific look that surgeons have coming out of a long procedure, not tired exactly, more like a machine that has been running at full capacity and is now returning to baseline, all systems still elevated. She said, Dad, what are you doing here? I said, I was in the area. She looked at me. I said, the patient? She said, he's stable. Surgery went well. It was a good one. I said, good. She sat down in the chair beside me. She leaned her head back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said, you didn't need to come. I said, I know. She said, I'm not complaining. I said, I know that too. We sat there for a few minutes without talking. The waiting room was mostly empty by that point. Late Saturday afternoon, the morning's families having largely gotten their news and dispersed. The light through the window had gone from the flat white of midday to the particular amber of late afternoon in August. That hour when the day is still hot, but the light has started to look like it is thinking about leaving. I told her about the corridor. Not all of it. The version that was appropriate to tell a daughter about an interaction with a hospital administrator, which is shorter and flatter than the version I am telling you now, because the internal experience of being assessed and redirected is not something I narrate to my daughter in full unless she needs to hear it. She listened. Then she said, "What did you say?" I told her what I said, about waiting for my daughter who was performing surgery, about being Gerald Mack. She said, "And then what?" I said, "And then he saw the plaque." Diana was quiet for a moment. Then she did something I did not expect. She laughed. Not the complicated laugh of someone processing a small injustice. The full, genuine, unguarded laugh of a person who finds something actually funny and does not feel the need to manage that. She said, "He saw the plaque." I said, "He saw the plaque." She said, "Dad?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I need you to know that I have complicated feelings about that plaque in general and what it represents for my reputation in this building." I said, "I know." She said, "And I also need you to know that the image of him seeing the plaque after that conversation is extremely satisfying to me." I said, "I thought it might be." She said, "Don't tell anyone I said that." I said, "I won't." We sat in the waiting room for another half hour. She had paperwork to do and post-op notes to write, and I read while she worked, the two of us in a room together in the specific quiet of people who are comfortable in each other's presence without requiring the presence to be performed. She finished her notes and stood and said she was going to check on the patient and then go home and sleep for approximately 11 hours. I said, "Good." She said, "Drive safe." I said, "Always." She started to walk away. Then she stopped and turned back and said, "Dad?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm glad you were close to the building." She said it in the specific way that Diana says things she means completely, which is briefly and without decoration. And then she walked back toward the surgical floor, and I watched her go. The scrubs and the confident step and the particular way she carries herself in this building where she has spent 6 years becoming exceptional. And I thought about an 11-year-old girl in a waiting room in Shreveport deciding who she was going to be. She decided correctly in my completely unbiased assessment as her father. I drove home to Houston. It was a long drive, and I took it slowly, which is what you do when you are 61, and you have just spent a day sitting in a hospital chair, and the August heat has been sitting on the car for 8 hours, and your back has reminded you several times that it has been with you for a long time and has registered some complaints. I stopped once for gas and once for food at a diner outside Montgomery, where the coffee was better than it had any right to be, and the woman who refilled my cup asked if I was driving far, and I said Houston. And she said, "Well, you've got a ways to go." And I said, "Yes, ma'am," and drank the coffee and thought about how much of life is simply going a ways to go and not minding the distance. I drove the rest of the way with the radio off. I am a person who thinks better in quiet, and I had things to think about, not urgently, not the kind of thinking that requires resolution before you get where you're going. The kind of thinking that is really just letting the day settle into its correct proportions, the way sediment settles in water when you stop stirring it. I thought about my father. He worked at that petrochemical plant for 33 years and retired with a pension that was adequate and a body that carried 33 years of physical labor in every joint. He was not a complainer. I do not know if I ever heard my father complain about the conditions of his life with the register of complaint. He observed things. He was precise and accurate in his observations. He said things like, "The plant is the plant, and they run it the way they run it." And these were not expressions of resignation. They were expressions of a man who understood where he was and worked within it, without pretending it was something it wasn't. He was the most grounded person I have ever known. He had no illusions about the gap between what the world said he was and what he actually was, and the absence of illusion did not cost him his dignity. He wore his dignity the way he wore his good suit, with complete comfort and no performance. I thought about what he would have said about the man in the corridor. He would have said something brief and exact. He would not have required the man to have been different than he was. He would not have been surprised. He would have found the plaque deeply amusing in the specific way of a man who has waited long enough for the world to catch up to what he already knew. I thought about my mother in that waiting room in Shreveport and the surgery that kept her in the world long enough to know Diana and to see Diana become who Diana became. She died 4 years ago at 81 in her own bed, with Diana holding her hand because Diana had flown to Shreveport on 24 hours' notice when the call came and sat with her grandmother for the last 2 days and held her hand at the end the way an 11-year-old girl had sat in a waiting room and decided what kind of person she was going to grow up to be. My mother knew about the wing. I had told her when the gift was finalized, and she had been quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Gerald, your name is going to be on a wall in a hospital." And then she said, "Your father would have found that very funny." And then she laughed in the way she laughed, which started small and built, and I laughed too, and we sat on the phone 300 miles apart, laughing about a wall with a name on it and what my father would have said about it. I thought about all of this on the drive home. I thought about the corridor and the plaque and the man's face when he connected the two. I thought about Diana in the surgical suite for 6 hours, doing work that would determine whether a man she had never met before Friday would go home to his family. I thought about the waiting room and the amber light and Diana in scrubs saying, "I'm glad you were close to the building." I got home at midnight. The house was quiet, in the way it is quiet when you have lived in it alone for long enough that the quiet is not absence, but atmosphere. I made tea. I sat in the kitchen for a while. I thought about what I wanted to say about the day. If I were ever going to say anything about it, this is what I want to say. I thought about what I felt in the corridor when the man did what he did. I have been in enough rooms in my life to have a calibrated response to being assessed incorrectly, which is to say I no longer feel the specific heat of it the way I did when I was younger and still expected the world to read me accurately on first contact. What I feel now is something cooler, something that observes the moment with a certain detachment and files it in the relevant category and does not require the immediate resolution of the emotional response. What I felt in the corridor was that specific coolness, the detachment, the filing. And then, when he turned and saw the plaque, what I felt was something that I am still working to describe accurately because it was not triumph, and it was not vindication, and it was not the satisfaction of having been proven right in an obvious way. It was something quieter than that. It was the recognition that the world contains more information than any one person's first assessment of another person can access, and that the gap between the assessment and the information is not a problem to be solved in the moment, but a condition to be patient with over time. The plaque had been on that wall for 14 months. The man had been walking that corridor for presumably at least that long. The information was always there. He simply had not needed it until he did. I have lived inside that gap my entire life. The gap between how I am read in the first 10 seconds and who I am after 10 years. Most people who look like me have lived inside some version of this gap. You learn to operate in it. You learn that the gap is not a verdict and not an obstacle. It is simply the distance between one person's incomplete data and your actual reality. And the actual reality does not require the gap to close in order to be real. The work is real, whether or not the man in the corridor has read the plaque. The work was real before the plaque existed. Diana understood that when she was building her surgical career in a building that would eventually have her name on it in a way she had complicated feelings about. She built the career first. She built it from the same materials I built from, which is the willingness to do the work at the full cost of the work, regardless of who in the corridor is reading the first 10 seconds of you correctly or not. She is 34 years old, and she has already learned the lesson that some people take 60 years to learn, and some people never learn at all. I am proud of her for what she built. I am also proud of her for knowing that what I built does not define what she built, and that the two things stand separately and are better for standing separately, and that the only connection between them that actually matters is the one that lives in the specific quiet of a hospital waiting room on a Saturday afternoon in August, when a father and a daughter sit in chairs and she finishes her notes, and they exist in the same room without needing the room to mean more than it means. That is enough. It has always been enough. If you have ever walked into a room and been read incorrectly in the first 10 seconds and kept walking anyway, and let the work speak for itself over time, you know what this story is about. Not the plaque, not the moment in the corridor, the 30 years of decisions before either of those things existed, the choices that made the plaque possible, and the choices that made your daughter possible, and the understanding that both of those things are yours in ways that no one's first assessment of you in a corridor can touch. The work was always there. The wall just said so out loud. I want to say one more thing before I'm done, and it is about Diana rather than about me, because she deserves the last word in her own story, even if this version of it is being told by her father. She called me 2 days after I drove home from Atlanta. She said, "Dad, I've been thinking about what you told me about the corridor." I said, "Oh?" She said, "I think you handled it right, not making it into something larger than it was, not explaining yourself, just letting the wall do it." I said, "I had 30 years of practice not explaining myself in corridors." She said, "I know, and I've had 6 years of practice in this building, and I want to tell you something that I haven't said out loud before." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "The plaque makes things harder for me here in some ways. You know that. I told you when you made the gift. People look at my name and they look at that wall and they make a calculation that I have to undo every time I walk into a room." I said, "I know." She said, "But here is what I've figured out in the 2 years since the wing opened. The people who make that calculation and hold it, who decide before they've worked beside me that what I have is given rather than earned, those people correct themselves within about 3 months, because the work corrects them. You can't maintain a wrong assessment of a surgeon's competence indefinitely when you are standing in the same operating theater watching them work. The evidence accumulates, and eventually it overwhelms the assumption. I said, yes. She said, so the plaque is a 3-month problem and the career is a 30-year answer. I can live with that math. I told her that was one of the clearest things I had ever heard her say. She said, I learned it from watching you. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, your grandmother would have had something good to say about that. Diana said she would have said something short and devastating and then changed the subject. I said, exactly. We were quiet for a moment. Then Diana said, drive safe, which is what she says to end phone calls, always, regardless of whether I'm driving anywhere. And I said, always, which is what I always say back. And we hung up. The work was always there. The wall just said so out loud. See you in the next one.